1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Spock Talk, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and child care become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died? We have another listener request. Listeners, are you a boomer? Do you know a boomer? If you have a childhood memory of Spock's baby and childcare, let us know. You can leave it in a review on Apple Podcasts and we'll read it in a future episode.
Last episode, we covered Spock's personal relationships with women. In this episode, we're covering politics, starting with Spock's personal political opinions and beliefs. And then we'll move on to how parenting advice relates to political ideology. As a young man, Benjamin Spock grew up in a Republican household, and when he was in college, Yale was mostly conservative and apolitical. When Spock transferred to the medical school at Columbia, that's when he first encountered political opinions that were different than what he grew up with. In his memoir, he wrote that at Columbia, some students were avowed Democrats, a few even socialists. He formed his own political ideas by being, I would say, an annoying social component. He described how he would take Republican positions when he was around Democratic medical school student friends, and he would take liberal positions when he was around his conservative undergraduate friends.
Okay, I actually have a good friend who does exactly this. And I feel like once you're in the inner circle and you know about their conversational strategy, you should just earn one of those Wile E. Coyote signs that you can hold up at any moment that just says, I get it, you can stop.
Eventually, though, Spock realized that being a conversational contrarian was not a way to win friends and influence people. Eventually, he settled on being a New Deal liberal, especially because of what he observed during the Depression. He admired Franklin Roosevelt and agreed with his methods of employing people through government projects like sweeping up parks, painting murals in post offices. His wife, Jane, however, was a little bit more politically radical when they were young. In the late 1930s, she was a socialist and involved with the American Labor Party. When Spock finished medical school, Jane quit her job and was a big volunteer and activist in the drive to repeal prohibition. She protested and raised donations outside the New York Public Library, and if you can picture this, her anti-prohibition group put her on a truck with a microphone so she could travel to more sites around the city.
All right, so I just need to break in right now to address both of our super cringy faces because this is Jane, Spock's first wife, of the alcohol and Milltown-induced schizophrenia. So we obviously see this as a foreshadowing and a bit of irony having to do with her issues with alcohol down the road. I think a lesser person would make a joke right here about how maybe keeping prohibition on the books would have helped Jane out, but instead I'm reaching for a statistic about whether prohibition actually reduced drinking amongst the populace. And I will have you know that according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, alcohol consumption fell sharply at the beginning of prohibition to approximately 30% of its pre-prohibition level. But during the next several years, alcohol consumption increased sharply to about 60 to 70% of its pre-prohibition level. So I feel like it would have gotten back up to 100% eventually anyway.
If you ban something, it sometimes makes it more appealing. Later, to give himself credibility in a I wasn't always a radical type of way, Spock would talk in political speeches about how he was born and raised a Republican and how he used to vote Republican because his father did. And then when he was a public figure later on, because of the best-selling Baby and Childcare, he used his clout to endorse national political figures. In 1956, Spock stumped for Adlai Stevenson. Now here's a little aside. A lot of the time, I am fuzzy on American history details, so Just for anybody else who didn't always bother to memorize names and dates beyond the test, Adlai Stevenson II was the Democratic Party nominee for president of the United States in 1952 and 1956. He lost both elections to Eisenhower. And Adlai Stevenson II was the son of Adlai Stevenson I, who was 23rd Vice President of the United States from 1893 to 1897 during Grover Cleveland's presidency. Is this common knowledge? Did you know that Adlai Stevenson was a Nepo baby?
No, honestly, I assumed that name was so distinctive you were only allowed to use it once.
I've never met an Adlai.
No, nor have I.
One of Spock's endorsements famously was John F. Kennedy in 1960. Spock and Jane were invited to the White House during the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations. Spock's memoir name drops the hell out of these events. Prince William, I wrote Prince William, but I must have meant Charles, President Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, Mrs. John Steinbeck.
No first name. No first name.
No.
Mrs. John. Okay, love it. He's consistent, that Spock.
British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. Let's listen to some scripted banter between Dr. Benjamin Spock and Jacqueline Kennedy for a promotional campaign video, which is in the public domain from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum.
I'm Dr. Benjamin Spock. I flew down to Washington this morning to do a small job for Senator Kennedy's campaign and have made a call at the Kennedys. It's fun to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted, Dr. Spock, and very grateful that you would take the time from a busy schedule to come here from Cleveland. I wondered perhaps you'd tell me some of the issues that you think are the most important in this campaign.
The one that has me most steamed up is federal aid to education, because I think in the present state of our country, both in terms of its ability to pay for things and its need for educated people, that this is one of the jobs that we ought to get started on. And I'm delighted that Senator Kennedy has made a big issue of this in the campaign, and even more important that in the years previously, in his 14 years in Congress and in the Senate, he really has worked hard for aid for education.
Thanks to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum for that clip. Spock even supported Lyndon B. Johnson until Johnson turned Vietnam into a full-scale war, at which point Spock felt very betrayed and disillusioned with LBJ and the Democratic Party. Spock called his own anti-war activism a kind of delayed adolescent rebellion and self-analyzed this in an Oedipal way, saying that LBJ was like his father figure and Spock was able to defy him by protesting the war and as a result, embraced his true self.
He just can't leave the Freud be. Is vocally opposing the president's positions all it takes for an edible complex? Because if so, the term has lost all meaning and applies to all Americans at this point.
To situate ourselves in time here, this was during the Cold War nuclear arms race between the U.S. and the USSR. And in the early 1960s, Spock became an anti-nuclear activist. In 1962, he joined the national board of an organization called National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which was referred to as SANE, S-A-N-E, all caps. And this was motivated because he advocated for nuclear disarmament and to end nuclear testing, which nuclear threats are something I don't even think about because we have so many other things to worry about, like climate change and school shootings. Katie, how does nuclear winter rank on your worry list?
Okay, well, I feel like nuclear power is often touted by conservatives as an alternative to the tree huggers, wind and solar. So there's quite a bit of this was never dangerous, anything that told you otherwise was propaganda floating around out there. So I feel like I hear about nuclear power quite a bit, and that among conservative circles that recognize that climate change is happening, even if they deny man's role in changing it, Nuclear is kind of a hot topic as an alternative to fossil fuels that's more effective than wind or solar and supposedly way safer than we've been led to believe. I'm skeptical, but maybe because I've just been effectively propagandized to fear nuclear winter.
Yeah, there was just a leak at a nuclear facility in Minnesota, and the PR around it was like, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. It's not in the Mississippi River at all.
Because we know that we should really trust officials when they tell us that our water supply is safe.
Mm-hmm. So I listened to a delightful 1989 interview with Spock and his second wife, Mary Morgan, on a podcast called And Now I've Heard Everything. Spock discussed how he got really concerned about nuclear testing and its effect on children and how it increased their risk for developing cancers because of radiation exposure. As for the anti-nuclear activism, although he was used to giving talks and writing about child development, he didn't feel he was an expert on radiation and disarmament. And he was elected co-chair of SANE, which he felt unqualified for, but he still accepted that position.
Yeah. What must it be like to never experience imposter syndrome? The people elected me, so even if I feel unqualified, they must see something in me that I was previously unaware of, and I must actually be qualified. I was just elected to my kid's PTA, the main qualification for which is to be a parent of a kid at the school, and I still feel unqualified.
Oh, Katie, you can do it. I believe in you. In a New York Times Magazine retrospective about Spock after he died, Margaret Talbot wrote that Spock's modesty of tone only reinforced his authority. But I can't help but wonder, is this a rhetorical trick of Spock, or is he genuinely sincere because he says he's insecure and modest, but still he does these things that require quite a bit of confidence? So I'm not sure if the modesty is false or sincere.
Yeah, I'm too cynical to think it's not calculated. He was clearly aware that his folksy tone is part of what set him apart from the rigidity of the experts that came before, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm with you.
Another aspect of the political situation in that era was civil rights, and Spock was an advocate for civil rights. He palled around with Martin Luther King Jr. They actually met on an airplane in 1965 when Spock approached King and tried to convince King to align himself with the anti-war movement. They marched together in 1967 and gave speeches together. Spock wrote a New York Times editorial that was supportive of civil rights and linked it to the anti-war movement as having the same goals broadly. And I read about this with great weariness because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very purposefully focused on civil rights. It wasn't that he wasn't anti-war, but he couldn't afford to alienate President Johnson and his support of the civil rights legislation. And so what Spock does is he asked King to lend his name and his activism to the anti-war movement, which would have been at the expense of the civil rights movement. So Spock was pretty much the antithesis of how to be a good ally. Am I right?
Like you, my American history knowledge is embarrassingly sparse, but my consumption of prestige TV dramas has taught me that this was a sacrifice asked often of people of color during the civil rights movement, not just to fight for anti-war causes, but it comes up a lot when it comes to feminist causes, at least on television.
Mm-hmm. So in 1967, Spock wanted SANE to join other groups to march for peace in New York, but this was pretty controversial. SANE was relatively conservative. Spock and SANE eventually broke up because Spock thought that the SANE people were too timid and the SANE people thought Spock was too radical. So Spock took his anti-war activism on the road. At his own expense, he gave talks at universities, press conferences, television interviews. He'd talk about the history of the occupation of Vietnam, how Johnson betrayed the American public, how Hoover was wrong. When Johnson declined to run for his second term, Spock considered that to be a success.
All right, so we've been pretty Debbie Downer up to this point, so I'm going to choose to cast this in a hopeful light and say that I really love how this shows that you don't have to fit into a box to work for a good cause. Maybe it's just because we live in such strongly partisan times, but it's hard to see how Spock could speak out against the war and be so conservative in other ways. But maybe that's really something we need more of, so people don't feel they have to be fully on board with a whole slew of issues that they might be ambivalent about in order to act on one that they feel strongly about.
Mm-hmm. Spock described himself as a dilettante when he went to the civil disobedience demonstrations, and he was pretty old compared to a lot of the anti-war activists, and he wrote that he would wear his suits to help remind people that it was a carefully considered demonstration, and he deemed it worthy of great respect. However, lots of people didn't care for his anti-war stance. Here's an anecdote. In 1967, he had ordered a new sailboat to live on in his retirement, but the longshoremen of New York refused to load the yacht of a rich trader. So Spock couldn't get it on a freight boat either, so he had to hire 3 men to sail it to the Virgin Islands instead.
I sincerely hope that this new, more enlightened Spock took this all in stride, because I'm really choking back a poor you couldn't get anyone to move your yacht comment.
Someone hit him in the head with a raw egg when he was attending a peace vigil outside of the White House in 1967. Then he was arrested for the first time at a political protest. It's kind of a cute story. He couldn't figure out how to get past the police barricades at a War Resisters League protest, and he whined to the chief inspector about it. And the chief inspector told him where there was a gap in the barriers. And so Spock crawled his way through, and then he was arrested right as soon as he got through. He protested with Allen Ginsberg, Noam Chomsky, and Abby Hoffman. In 1968, he was indicted for aiding Vietnam War draft dodgers along with 4 other older men, and they were all together called the Boston Five. The charge was conspiracy to counsel draft resistors by giving them moral and financial support, and he was found guilty in what he called a dull trial, and the decision was reversed later for lack of evidence of guilt. He actually ran for president of the United States as a People's Party candidate. He had a pretty great platform. The People's Party was feminist, democratic, socialist, against the draft, and for disarmament.
You know, I was just going to say someone like Spock would make for a pretty great political candidate today, but he'd have to take over one of the 2 major parties instead of running as a third party, which is okay because celebrities can do that all the time, no problem.
Totally. He was arrested so many times that it becomes not even interesting to read about after a point, more than 20 times between the 1960s and 1980s.
Woo!
Yeah, he and second wife Mary Morgan were activists after the Vietnam War ended for things like Reagan's cuts to social safety net programs. I obtained a few of Spock's speeches from the Syracuse University archives, home of the Dr. Benjamin Spock and Mary Morgan papers, and his anti-war writing isn't so different from his parenting advice. He advocated for dignifying individuals, even commie dictator bullies, and for building mutual trust. He wanted the United States foreign policy approach to be more humane, less violent. He wanted, instead of imposing sanctions on communist countries, to send food aid, which he argued that generosity would do a lot more to convince the citizens of those countries that democracy was better than communism. He thought the United States should have given awards to Soviet astronauts, scientists, artists to establish goodwill. Basically, he wanted the U.S. to solve hunger, poverty, disease, and illiteracy.
That's really lovely.
I know. I really love his political writing. As an idealistic lefty myself, I agree with most of what he says. But I do think he saw a great deal more potential in America as a benevolent world power. And to me, a person in 2023, that seems pretty unfounded at this point in time.
But kind of adorably naive.
Mm-hmm.
For someone who so desperately wanted to be liked and thrived on public adoration, it seems weird that he would pursue causes that made him so unpopular.
I know. He was such an iconic expert, and then the anti-war and anti-nuclear stuff was just too much of a departure for his core fan base. But then he got a whole new fan base in the rabble-rousing youths. In the late 1960s, there were several popular magazine articles discussing Spocklash. Here's a glorious quotation from a conservative columnist, Stuart Alsop, who wrote that young people had been, quote, Spocked when they should have been spanked. There was blowback against what some people called the Spock generation, the boomers, and the terms permissive and discipline became code words politically. This is a very Joan Didion-esque the center will not hold moment when discipline was a stand-in for convention. The social structure of the United States changed very quickly because of the civil rights movements, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, and folks who didn't care for the changes blamed the baby boomers and, by extension, the man who raised them all, Dr. Benjamin Spock, because he was the post-war authority on child rearing. He wasn't really all that permissive, though, but that was the public impression.
Maybe the people who criticize his permissiveness didn't really read his books. I mean, leaving your infant outside in the cold for 2 to 3 hours a day doesn't exactly sound like the height of coddling.
Right. They didn't read his books. It was just perception. It wasn't really in the text. Maybe because he was not willing to take a stance on corporal punishment, one way or the other, contributed to this impression of permissiveness. This is a good time to zoom out and discuss the political and ideological nature of child care advice. There are a couple of fun theories about Spock's influence on American culture. One, that the nature of post-war parenting was small d democratic ideology disguised as parenting advice. And two, that post-war parenting advice worked to create a complacent workforce that helped America be an economic superpower. These are theories that give a lot of credence to parenting advice, maybe more than they deserve. We already talked about how baby and child care was infused with Freudian theory, and this happened in Great Britain and in France, too. There were influential pediatricians in Great Britain, Donald Winnicott and Susan Isaacs, who also melded psychoanalytic psychology with parenting advice, and Francoise Dolto did the same thing a little later for French children. There's an academic named Richard Bates who wrote about how these parenting experts believed that the widespread application of psychoanalytic theory would help produce democratic citizens and ward off the dangers of authoritarian personalities.
Okay, so I was all prepared to comment on how we were just shoving anti-communism into every nook and cranny of children's lives back then, and how cartoonish and overblown it feels now. And then I did a quick Google, and I wanted to find some anecdotes, and I found that at the end of last year, 2022, the governor of my very own state signed a bill that will require public school students to observe Victims of Communism Day on November 7th every year. Which, what? Just when I think the place I live couldn't get any weirder.
Oh my gosh, I want to start a Victims of Capitalism Day.
You could probably get that passed in your state.
Okay, so Bates wrote that educating parents to raise psychologically healthy children was for the good of the Republic. Spock thought that folks who followed dictators were driven by repressed anxieties and resentment, and so a child raised in a reasonable manner who is given some autonomy is going to make good choices. A properly led child will want to go to bed on time and eat nutritious food without needing to be forced.
Hang on, I feel attacked. Are you telling me I'm not properly leading my children?
I'm not sure if you can really link permissiveness to democratic principles. Bates thinks that a child cannot be a very good participant in a democracy if they are raised by a parent or taught by a teacher who acts like a dictator.
I mean, I guess this argument makes a little bit of sense to me on its face because, of course, the dominant culture, which was so heavily emphasizing this pro-capitalist, pro-American, anti-communist rhetoric, of course, that's going to impact what's viewed as appropriate or desirable when it comes to child rearing. Like, isn't that the lesson we learn from every popular parenting guide that attempts to tell us why other cultures actually do it better? Like, we talked about Bringing Up Bebe and the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, or even that adorable show on Netflix where little kids in Japan go run errands by themselves. I mean, does the fact that I can't even think of an example of a popular parenting book about how Russians do it better mean that Spock was ultimately successful in bringing down communism?
They actually studied like what the Soviets were doing, and that affected some of the parenting advice of the era.
Really? I love that. I mean, I don't love it. It just seems consistent.
Right. So that's a good lead into the second theory, which has more to do with capitalism. There was a corporate mentality to mid-century America that really valued group harmony, and that is partly what baby and child care tried to achieve, i.e. a way for parents and their kids to get along in a harmonious way. Baby and Child Care was first published around the same time as Peter Drucker's book about General Motors, which popularized the notion that workers would be more productive if they were not treated in an overly paternalistic way. This harmonious group vibe is all in service to the national interest, which is basically dominating the New World Order through economic might.
All right, this one is where you lose me, because I think we do have to be careful how much of this we ascribe to Spock and how much might just be Spock reflecting these ambient values back to the public. So I think we can definitely say that Spock's work overtly impacted American culture in the child rearing and family space, but the farthest we can go when it comes to anti-communism and pro-capitalist messaging is to say that he was part of this larger cultural trend towards emphasizing these ideas without being a conscious thought leader there. Does that wash with you?
Yes, I think he was very deliberate about the Freudian stuff, but the corporate mentality, I just don't see it in baby and child care. We're here to answer the question, why does Spock's influence endure? Why is his very old child care manual still in bookstores in its 10th incarnation? And while Spock's political activism later in life against nuclear proliferation, against the Vietnam War, it didn't help him sell books. His activism was newsworthy and kept his name, his profile in the public sphere. And the anti-war stuff made him ostracized by people his own age, his contemporaries, but it introduced him to a whole new generation of folks who thought he was right on, super principled, a hip anti-war activist in a dapper suit. Liked or not liked, the political activity kept his name in the public's consciousness. Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. In the 1957 edition of Baby and Child Care, Spock wrote, "Now is the time to get an automatic washer and dryer if you can possibly afford them. They save hours of work each week and precious energy." Katie, what does the 10th edition say about buying a washer and dryer or procuring any other time-saving household appliance?
Okay, so as someone who has been thoroughly steeped in the pregnancy and parenting industrial complex, something I found really refreshing about the 10th edition is that it places a lot of emphasis on the bare necessities that you need and is careful to say that you mostly do not need any of that other stuff.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, there's no mention of whether or not to have a washer and dryer, but the 10th edition is very pro-laundry service for parents that choose to use cloth diapers. The book stops short of saying it's just plain gross to wash diapers yourself, but it does go into some detail as to what a pain washing them is and recommends one add-on I didn't even know existed. A high-pressure sprayer that attaches to the toilet. Do you want to hear the quote?
Yeah. Like a bidet for diapers?
Mm-hmm. It says,
Okay.
First, scrape the contents of the diapers into the toilet. A high-pressure sprayer that attaches to the toilet makes rinsing faster and easier. Next, put the diapers into a covered pail, partially filled with water, with 1/2 cup of borax or bleach per gallon. Clean the diaper pail each time you do a diaper wash. Wash the diapers with mild soap or detergent and rinse 2 or 3 times. Seems like a lot of work to me.
Oof, diaper service all the way. Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. See this episode's show notes for our references.
If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcasts, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
Special thanks to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. We'll see you soon the next time we talk Spock.